It's great to be here. It's been really exciting to hear the presentation so far and to chat with people during the networking sessions. Really enjoyed that. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some more thoughts on the environmental impacts of this industry in progress. So yes, I'm the founder of Informed Sustainability Consulting. My background is in the environmental assessment of food and agriculture products. I got my PhD from Purdue University studying bioenergy, and then realized that if I was in agriculture, I should really be working in food, since that's what most of us deal with, and that's most of what agriculture produces. So I've shifted over the last 7 years or so to working on food issues. Hence my past work with the Good Food Institute, with the Humane Society, and with the Food and Climate Alliance. So I'm really happy to be a part of this industry and to really kind of help make this industry a more beneficial impact on our environment and the world we're a part of. I founded Informed Sustainability Consulting. So I really want to highlight that this reason that I'm here, both in this industry and here today, is that I really want to help all of the participants in this industry, whether you're an investor, a company, a startup, a member of the public who's interested in this, a member of an established company who wants to take a look at this, help you understand what the environmental impacts of our food system are and how plant-based and cell-based products can lead to a more sustainable future. So I like doing a little bit of nature photography on the side, and I want to bring in some of the thoughts from Ryan's presentation opening today's section of the conference, and think about how we got to where we are in the year 2030. So this is also a theme in my presentation, and I'm really glad that Ryan brought that up early on today, and think about how we're going to produce the materials and the foods that we need, and how we get there from today, 2020, to where we can be in 2030. I also want to think a little bit more broadly about cells as technology that Ryan was talking about too, and think beyond that to ecosystems and agriculture as technology. So if you look at this picture, there's trees on a mountainside, in the fog, in a forest. There's a lot happening in this picture. We have photosynthesis going on, which is transforming solar energy into chemical energy in the plants here. We have respiration going on. We have fungal decomposition going on. We have plants building cellular materials. We have building cellulose and intercellular matrix. All of these factories, all of these processes in this sort of circular economy that's happening anywhere and everywhere in the world simultaneously. And I think what the real promise of some of these technologies and some of these ideas are to harness some of these existing biological technologies to, as we've harnessed agriculture in the past 10,000 years, to come up with a new and more efficient way of producing the foods and the materials that we need to move forward on a planet with 10 billion people. So that's kind of a super 50,000 foot view of kind of where I'm coming from with this today. So again, I'm focused on metrics-based sustainability. I'm a scientist. I like to measure things. I want to help understand the environmental footprint of products in this industry, identify the opportunities for companies and participants, stakeholders to reduce environmental impact from current technologies and within the industry, and to communicate the environmental benefits and potential pitfalls of these factors to investors, to business partners, and to the general public. That's my focus. So in the past 18 months or so of my consulting work, I've been fortunate to work with a lot of players in the plant-based and cell-based fermentation food industries. All of the organizations here are some of the ones that I've had the chance to work with. Forward Food, program of the Humane Society, I do a lot of ongoing work with, and projects with all of these different organizations. So if you are interested in any of these, I encourage you to follow up with me afterwards as well. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what sustainability is. It's a big buzzword, but it does actually mean something. We're going to talk about in terms of environmental systems, what are the limits that we work within globally, how we measure environmental sustainability against those limits, and what we know about the environmental impacts of meat and its many forms. So the definition of sustainability that we've worked with for the past 33 years comes from Gro Harlem Brundtland and her UN Commission report, Our Common Future. Talking about sustainability means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's a powerful statement, and it carries a lot of meaning. There's a lot of pieces to this that we can delve into further. This is not a discussion on sustainability broadly, so I'll skip that. But we really need to focus on some basic questions that this definition raises. Whose needs are we meeting specifically? Which needs of those people? And most importantly, how do we prioritize between all of these different people's needs and the different needs they each have? There's a lot here. Our civilization is fairly complex and it's very large, which raises a lot of issues. So that's that first bullet point there is the social and economic elements of sustainability, thinking about the triple bottom line. But today we're really going to be focused on the second point there. How are we limited by the environment? And how are we limited by the state of technology? What resources do we have access to? And will future generations have access to meet all of those needs? So how do we get the resources and provide for our needs with the resources that we have, with the technology that we have? So I'm focused on really looking at how are we limited by the environment, and how do changing technologies like plant-based and cell-based meat change the way we interact with the environment? So environmental systems. I really am a fan of the planetary boundaries framework that came out of a lot of some academic labs recently. We're going to talk about Earth's limits. So the planet Earth is a complicated system. You recall I talked about all those things that were happening in a picture of the forest. Those happen all around the planet 24/7, and they create the environments that we need as a civilization and as individuals to live. So there are about a dozen different Earth systems that basically keep the planet running in a way that we need it to survive. So some of them are characterized here. We've got biodiversity, we've got climate, we have the ozone layer that protects us from the sun, we have the ocean acidity, nutrient cycling, water cycle. Some of these you're probably familiar with. You know that keeping forests healthy, we need to keep the planet healthy. You know that we need to keep the climate stable to keep ourselves healthy. We need to keep the water cycle running. So some of these are familiar and some of these might be. But this chart really just highlights which ones are in trouble. If you're at least my age or older, you know that the ozone layer was in trouble a few decades ago. You can see now, get my cursor out here, right now it was in a danger zone, but thanks to some technology innovations, we've now, oops, shucks, I gave away that. So thanks to some technology innovations, we're now in a safe zone. So we've fixed the hole in the ozone layer that we caused, of course. So technology caused the problem, and technology fixed it. And now we have these areas, nutrient cycling, where here in the yellow and the orange, we're in a big danger zone. We are beyond the healthy green limits of what the planet can basically cycle for us. We're beyond the planet's nutrient cycling capabilities. Climate change is in the yellow danger zone, and we're getting worse. So we need to keep an eye on how much we're damaging the Earth's climate cycling capabilities. And you can see biodiversity and forest health, AKA land use, are also in danger zones. So I use this chart to really think about what aspects of the environment we need to consider and are the most important to keep civilization running. So take just a moment to think about what you think this chart would look like if we didn't, without the impacts of agriculture. Agriculture uses a lot of land, as climate change emissions, we use fertilizers, etc. Just take a moment and think where we might be. I already gave the answer away with my accidental click earlier, but you can see we're in a pretty good place if only people didn't need to eat. So really what I'm going to talk about for the moment here is the impact of food systems on the Earth systems. So if we think about climate change, about a quarter to a third of all of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. Now that includes not just agriculture and farming, but it also includes the energy and the fuel that we use to store, to package, to process, to refrigerate, and then to cook all of our foods. So it's a lot of steps, but in terms of one set of industries, a quarter to a third of our emissions is a lot. So it isn't all about fossil fuels. It isn't all about transportation and power generation. Food and agriculture are also a really big piece of the climate puzzle. And when we think about the climate impacts of the food system, it's really meat, dairy, and eggs. So this chart from one of my favorite sources, Our World in Data, shows us the carbon footprint of the average European Union diet. And you really see 83% of the emissions from producing and supplying the food in the EU comes from meat, eggs, and dairy. So when we talk about the climate change impacts of agriculture, we're mostly talking about the climate impacts of meat. When we think about land use around the world, which really powerfully affects the amount of forests we have available to cycle oxygen and nutrients, and the amount of biodiversity we have on planet Earth, which are really critical systems to keep civilization running. Most of our land use comes from agriculture. You can see in this chart here, again from Our World in Data, of all of the habitable land on Earth, over 100 million square kilometers, 1% or less is cities and infrastructure, 50% is agriculture. And of the half of all habitable land around the world that we use for agriculture, of course, that's land that used to be forests, shrubland, prairies, and now is not. Most of that we use for livestock. Again, meat, eggs, and dairy. And just a little bit we use for crops that we feed ourselves. And when we think about the efficiency of that land use, we're seeing that we're getting a fairly small amount of our total calories and total protein from that very large amount of land that we're using for livestock. So I think the main goals and the main promise of alternative proteins is to increase the efficiency of this land use and these climate footprints of agriculture so that we can produce meat, whether it's from plants or cells, about as efficiently as we produce it from the food that we currently use to feed ourselves. So that's a global figure. In the United States, we also use about 41% of the land in the country here for livestock. Again, let's look at the bottom when we share slides at the end of the conference. One of my favorite infographics of all time. Came from Bloomberg a couple of years ago, and really highlighting, this is just a very minor piece of that infographic showing how much of our land in the United States we use mostly pretty much for cows and some pigs and chickens. It's a lot. It's a lot more than we used to feed ourselves. And again, the issue here is that land is habitat. So feeding ourselves is the main reason that 24,000 of the 28,000 at-risk species around the world are at risk of extinction. So when we think about biodiversity and these crises, it really comes down to meat and land use. Water is also important habitat for those of you who are aware of oceans and rivers. So nutrient pollution, it's kind of an obscure thing. Not as many people know about nutrient pollution as know about burning forests or about climate change. But nutrient pollution and the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, are essentially byproducts of agriculture that because we've discovered how to make fertilizers and we concentrate animals that excrete their own fertilizers, and those pollute water around the world. So about 90% of the waterways in the United States are affected by over use of nutrients. And you can see the difference here in this photo. We have a healthy lake in a relatively natural state with lots of capability to support fish and other animals. And there's a barrier here separating agricultural runoff from the healthy part of the lake. And you can see that when we have all that agricultural runoff, we do not have a healthy lake. That problem is magnified all around the world. So all the areas in the world that are in orange or red are watersheds, areas with rivers and streams that are past their planetary boundary for fertilizer and manure production. And that's a lot of the planet. It's a lot of land. A paper that came out just a few weeks ago found that just livestock alone, so just animal agriculture, causes enough nutrient pollution to meet our planetary boundary. So we can either have everything else in society, or we can have livestock. And I think I know which part of that choice I would rather make. So there's also other factors in the planetary boundaries that aren't easy to measure. We can't have a really good way of quantifying these, but they're also, I think, important enough to at least mention. One is, so these other pollutants here. Some of this has to do with human health. Zoonotic disease is a really critical factor. It's hard to measure the pollutants that cause, or the factors around getting diseases from animals. But again, a report released just in the last month or so, the UN found that meat consumption is the main driver for the top two factors behind getting diseases from animals. One of the major pollutants that's difficult to measure, but it's becoming a very big issue, is our antibiotic resistance genes in bacteria and other microbes. About 70% of the medically important antibiotics for people actually are used in the livestock sector as growth promoters. This is a big problem because without effective antibiotics, we really can't have modern medicine. At least we can't have safe modern medicine. And so that is one of what the UK government has considered one of the greatest threats to modern civilization beyond climate change. So antibiotic resistance is a really big deal, even if it's hard to measure. So, okay, let's step back. We know what's important. It's those planetary boundaries. How do we actually measure those? What do I do day to day? And how can I help you figure out what is relevant here? So the method that I use most often is called life cycle assessment, or LCA. It's basically a carbon footprint on steroids. We think about the carbon footprint of meat or any other product, cell culture media, a house, jet fuel, any of those things. We're looking at how many resources, natural resources, went into making that product, what the processing steps are, how much energy gets used, what materials get used in processing, what the waste streams are, what the manufacturing process looks like, how it's distributed, and finally, what happens during the use and disposal of that product. Use and disposal are less immediately relevant for most of the things that I deal with, which are fuels and foods. We don't look at those disposal methods too carefully, although perhaps we should. But of course, it's a factor in food waste. So this is really what a product life cycle assessment is all about. You want to look at what the factors that drive global warming, land use, water pollution, and other important environmental impacts are in all of these stages of the production and use of a product. So when someone talks about a carbon footprint, they're looking at the global warming impacts of all of these different phases of the product, or at least they should. They usually are. So, but this is just one piece in an effective life cycle assessment, right? This really is just taking the data and crunching the numbers, but there's more to it than just that. We really want to be able to know that we're starting from the right questions. So some things that I can help people with is making sure that we're asking about the boundary, how we're drawing the boundaries for this product life cycle around the right product, that we're including the necessary ingredients. We don't have perfect information for everything, so where do you draw the line? We want to know that we're assessing the correct impacts and looking at the correct scope for this product. Are we looking at factory? Are we looking at national average data? Are we looking at global production? So answering all of those questions is important for doing this correctly. And of course, once you have results, you want to be able to do the right things with them. So again, helping companies decide what the uncertainties are in any assessment that they're doing, making sure that we're considering the scenarios that are relevant to their production system, and using that effectively in planning and communications. So that's what I do. Come back quick to metrics. So we want to answer the right questions for the right people about the right products, and come out with effective communications about the results. We're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. Again, how much greenhouse gases, from what steps of your process, and how easy is it to decarbonize. So again, the problem with animal agriculture is that animals are not directly fossil fueled, right? So if you have a coal plant, the answer there is pretty easy. Shut it down and put up a solar plant instead, or a wind turbine. You can't really do that with a cow yet, right? That's what we're working on. Well, in terms of land use, again, a lot of land use issues have to do with what ingredients, a lot of plant-based products. Maybe your protein source is really land use efficient, but you're sourcing coconut oil from Indonesia or from India. That will have a bit of a land use footprint. So we want to think about what other ingredients you are using to complete your product and your recipe. Of course, we want to look at nutrient pollution, nutrification, how much fertilizers do your upstream feedstocks consume, and how can you work with farmers maybe to change that, and those other risks people talk about that people are interested in. So of course, we talked a little bit about water, antibiotics, but energy use is a big topic, and water source pollution is also a major issue. So we want to consider what your stakeholders are interested in as well. So that's the background. Those are the issues that I work with. Those are the issues that we need to really focus on as an industry. And I'm going to walk through, and hopefully this will be at least somewhat interactive. It looks like I have a decent amount of time left, maybe 20 minutes. So I think we'll be able to make this a little bit interactive here before we get to, showing graphs and numbers, which of course I could do all day. If you want more graphs and numbers, talk to me on LinkedIn, call me up, talk to me anytime. I can do that for hours. But think about, what might a cell-based meat facility or a cell-based meat industry look like in 2030? So we have the very, very basic diagram that we've been seeing for the past couple of years in this industry. We take cell samples, we get starter cultures, and then through some process of proliferation, differentiation, and maturation, and scaffolding, we come up with a product. So that part of the process is really what I'm most interested in here. The bits before and after aren't very interesting to me, either because they're fairly small scale or because they are just necessary to be solved for this process to work. So if we want to look at a life cycle assessment of the cell-based meat factory, we're really looking at what happens here in cell culture, scaffolding, and differentiation, how we actually make the meat. So step one is, what actually do we grow the cells in? So we don't have an animal. We have a bioreactor instead. Those of you who are really into bioreactor technology, I am making some real broad assumptions here. I'm not going to spend the next, we don't have 3 hours to dive through all the elements of the model that I put together to look at this. So I will be glossing over some things and focusing on others. But really what I'm going to try and focus on here is, what are the actual material sources and energy sources that come into a cell-based meat biorefinery, and what comes out on the other side, which is really fundamentals for environmentalism. So what do we actually use? We don't have an animal with tissue and beating heart and blood to supply the cells. So what media are we growing these cells in, and how is it recycled? These are really important factors in terms of what the environmental impact and the cost of the system is going to be. So I'm actually, to do this component of our assessment, we don't have good data on the environmental impact of the pharmaceutical industry, which is our analogy for cell culture media production. So instead, I use what's called economic input-output LCA. Lots of acronyms there. All you need to know is that basically from an amount of money spent on cell culture media, we can estimate what the environmental impacts are of that media based on the overall environmental performance of the pharmaceutical products industry. So that's our first approximation. How much do we spend on media, and how efficient are we at recycling? Step one. Step two, what do we actually feed the cells? So in addition to the basal media and the growth factors and all those sort of pH balancing things, cells need to eat. So instead of feeding a cow grass or feeding a chicken soybeans, we are looking at feeding cells sugar and some amino acids, but that's, but really in terms of mass input to mass output, we're really interested in what those calorie sources are. So again, in this life cycle assessment model that I've developed, imagining 2030, there's a sort of cell growth consumption model based on recent science papers on large mammalian cells and large-scale bioreactors. But we're really interested in sort of how for the method, for the rate that cells grow, how much do we have to feed them? There's the third component in a model like this, of course, is scaffolding. So that's the other material that comes in. Whether your scaffolding ends up as part of the final product or gets recycled in the production system, you need some amount of feedstock. You need some source of material for that scaffold, and some amount of it, and how much flows through your production system, whether some of it is reused or whether it ends up in the final product. There are a lot. If you've been to some of the other recent talks or some of the other recent conferences on cell-based products, there's a lot of different materials and approaches to scaffolding. So for the purposes of trying to estimate, and imagine what things might look like in 2030, I've broken this up into two categories. You have your agricultural products, like textured soy protein, which came out with a big splash in a paper earlier this year, in January, and you have more maybe innovative things like decellularized spinach leaves or other plant products. But those all come from an agricultural source. You're growing a plant in a field and then using that to as a scaffold for your cell-based meat. The other options are to use a material like bacterial nanocellulose or PLLGA, one of these other products that you can produce in similar bioreactors to cell-based meat, but using bacterial fermentation or yeast fermentation, and use that material as a scaffold. So basically, I have a oversimplified model of agricultural production and an oversimplified model of bacterial fermentation. And so we have choices about which kind of material to use in our production process. Finally, there's the actual facility itself. Somewhere we have a building that has pipes coming into it and pipes going out of it. So there's a water pipe coming in, there's a wastewater pipe coming out, there are power lines coming in, there's chemicals and cleaning solutions and sterilization equipment. There are all these different pieces of the facility that need to operate in order to keep the bioreactors running and in order to keep literally the lights on, to operate the computers that people are using there, sanitization equipment, as I mentioned, all the other pieces of the facility that are operating within the same environment. So I know that I cut out, for example, the sort of scale up bioreactors from this model. I didn't include, what might have been sitting right here, the scale-up reactors or the starter cultures for fermentation. If you have a decent amount of those on site, then maybe you can sort of model that as saying, oh, our facility basically has a lot of laboratory space that we need to power. And that's one way of looking at this. So essentially the way that I've broken this down in the model is by saying, in addition to the energy requirements of the bioreactors themselves, what fraction of the facility resembles an office? What fraction of the facility resembles a pharmaceutical laboratory? And we have energy use data for buildings like that. And we can use that to estimate what the actual building looks like. So put all those together, and you've got a decent, rough model of a cell-based meat factory. I'm not going to show you my spreadsheet, so I'm not going to go into the details beyond that. You really don't need to. But I think what might be interesting before looking at the results from my analysis that my guesses, we're all guessing about 2030, is to ask some questions of the audience here. So we're going to ask you to be active in the chat. So please have that open. I hope you're at a computer. And we're going to go through those phases again. And I'm going to take the numbers that you give me, plug them into my spreadsheet, and present your results next to mine at the end of the hour. So please try and be active here. I'll pick some answers from the chat to plug into the model and look at some life cycle environmental impacts of cell-based meat at the end here. So first off, we're going to go back and look at the media recycle piece, so the media supply piece. So in 2030, again, we don't have pharmaceutical life cycle assessment the way that I'd like it to be in a process-based, but we have economic assessment. So how much do you think media will cost per liter in 2030? Let's just get some answers here. In the year 2030, so the one answer so far, Ben says 2020, I'm going to assume I'm not upper limit. I don't think $2,000 a liter. All right, 5 cents, 30 cents, 250. I am going to pull up my model in the background here and start plugging in some fun numbers. All right. So we've got some there. Any more votes? Anyone think that any of those are too high or too low? Okay, about $1. Great. How efficient do you think media recycling will be? Again, so give me a percent for every batch, or for every time you run a batch of media through the bioreactor. How much do you think it'll be recycled? If you have like a 2-day, for example, if you cycle the media in your bioreactor approximately every 2 days, how much of that media do you think will be spent? And how much of the components of that media do you think you'll be able to reuse during the second time? %, water. So yeah, we're not thinking about water here, but the actual expensive components. So like the buffers, the growth factors, the expensive parts of the media.
We're getting some great participation from the audience here. Please continue to engage and answer these fascinating interactive questions.
All right. I'm busily updating my model. We've got numbers between 20 and 80%, under 50%. All right. All right. Pretty good, pretty interesting here. All right. Let's next phase of the model. Let's think about the color inputs. This we might not spend so much time on. Most of the trouble with this part of the model is that most of the inputs here have to do with fairly detailed modeling of how cells respire in a bioreactor. So I'm actually going to skip over this because I think we're going to want more time to think about the results instead of trying to ask you what you think the growth rate factor for mammalian cells is per hour per million cells. We can talk about that later if you're interested, but we'll skip this for now and go to the scaffolding. What do we have votes on whether the, and actually, well, I'll skip this part of the question. Let's specifically go to question 2 here. How much scaffolding do you think there will be in the final product? Or thinking about it another way, for every kilogram of meat that comes out of this factory, how much scaffolding do you think either will be a part of that meat or will be involved in that production process? 5% to 10%. All right, do we have a few more votes? And you can specify here in the comments, if you think that if you're specifically thinking about an agricultural product like textured soy protein, or specifically thinking about a fermentation product, note that. Yeah, I'm definitely on the on Vin's page there. If you're going to call it cell-based meat, it should at least be 50% meat. All right, so fermentation at 50% is one option there. 60 to 80% really high for some of these. Okay. I'm going to go pretty quick here because I want to make sure we have time to talk about results. So we're going to call that good. Again, I really encourage you to keep thinking about these. Again, we'll go really quick through. What do you think, how big do you think a facility will be? If you want to think of in terms of a lot of the papers that are coming out now are saying, we know how to culture mammalian cells at least the scale of a 20,000 or 25,000 liter capacity. Assuming we can scale up high density culture for cell-based meat that way, excuse me, how many of those bioreactors do you think will be in one factory? Not getting a lot of interest in that question, so I'll just move forward. Maybe a more interesting piece of the facility, what fraction of the floor space do you think will be devoted to sort of high-tech, thanks for that response, Blake, that actually is in line with what I have in the default model. So you're basically going to assume making the same kind of assumptions that I am. Good to hear. So when we think about how much of the floor space of a facility, aside from all the fancy bioreactors and maturation tanks and the scaffolding extrusion machines, all those kind of things, how much of it do you think is background stuff like the scale-up bioreactors, the actual offices people are going to work in? Will all of that be in, if this is a huge facility, that all might just be 10% of the floor space. But if you have a relatively small facility, it might be as high as 20 or 30% of the facility. All right, so we have votes for about 30% of the facility being labs and offices. 15% on the low end. All right, any other responses? All right. Let's see, making sure my numbers add up to the percent here. Yeah, actually, Vin, you're right. So I used a local microbrewery that recently expanded into a medium-sized production facility as the basis for my model. So yeah, beer breweries are a great, like the large microbrewery size. It's a really useful framework for this. I agree. All right. So we've thought about this a bit. We've got some input from all of you. Gonna make sure that do one last quick check here. Oops, I thought that looked weird because I put the wrong numbers in the wrong places. All right, that looks better. All right, so now I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to move over and look at how the results of what we just talked about compare with previous assessments of cell-based meat and with plant and animal meat products. So I'm going to pop out of that and instead start sharing this. Can you see a graph? All right, thumbs up. I can't see the chat anymore, FYI, but that's fine. So now I have too many tabs open. All right, here we go. So what we're seeing here is basically the carbon footprint, the life cycle climate impacts of cell-based meats. So I have the model that I started with this morning in this sort of red color. My best guess is this little orange dot. And with your modifications, your inputs, your advice to me this morning, we adjusted that in our live session, CBN and cell-based meat, our live session, to a slightly different best estimate and a slightly different range of sort of best and worst values that I took from what you wrote into the chat there. So in terms of the carbon footprint of the cell-based meat product in the imaginary factory in 2030, what we think we can do, these dots are basically what we think our best guess for the industry is right now, based on what we know so far. Again, we're starting with pretty limited data. My biggest call to the industry right now is please help scientists get better data publicly for environmental impact. It's very important in like establishing this industry as the good thing that it can be. What we see here, so we're within the range that previous life cycle assessment studies gave us. So that's good news. And we're actually a little bit more optimistic than most of them. So that's also good news, right? We're thinking that this industry is going to look fairly good. How do we compare to existing products? Well, chicken is sort of frustratingly low carbon. There's a lot of other problems with chicken meat, and that's very real. But it is frustratingly difficult to beat on climate footprint. So, especially in the United States, chicken has pretty low carbon footprint. But if we're comparing with pork and definitely beef, you can see even our worst case sort of scenarios, if cell-based meat can get to market and sell at a competitive price, there's just basically no way that it's going to be the same or worse as beef. So at least in terms of replacing beef, we know we can do that in terms of carbon footprint. And if we get to sort of our best guesses, if we're not any more pessimistic than we need to be, then we can probably beat pork, fish, and shrimp too. And we're kind of in the same level as some of the plant-based products. So we have a really good potential to reduce our impact in terms of climate change. But you remember I said climate change isn't the end-all be-all, right? This is also about land use. This is about water pollution. So we can scroll down. I'm going to skip energy use because, again, like I told some of you in the chats, I don't care about energy use. I care about climate change and land use and water pollution. So when we look at land use, this is sort of that efficiency of production. How do we take farmland, cropland, land that used to be forest and shrubland and critical habitat for endangered species, and turn that into food? And what we see is that this is the really big potential victory for cell-based meat and for plant-based meat, right? We can be much more effective at turning land into food this way than we can with animals. So you heard me talking about chicken is really hard to decarbonize. It might not be that hard to beat on land use. So all that land that we're not using to feed chickens and pork, you can see beef, it's literally off the chart. There is just so much land use for beef, you wouldn't be able to see the difference between any of these different dots if beef was on here. It goes up to about 200 or 300 square meters per kilogram. So it's way up there. We're going to be able, if we can get to market, we can beat chicken, pork on land use. And you can see here, we might even be able to beat farmed fish and farmed shrimp on land use. So think about being able to beat fish on land use. That's pretty cool. I'm really stoked. I'm very excited about this possibility. And there's even the possibility that we could be on the same order of magnitude or even better than some of the plant-based things out there on land So this is really huge. Water consumption is important, but we're not going there. Again, that third environmental impact that I'm so passionate about, nutrient pollution, water pollution. And again, you see, we don't have the same quality of data here as we do for the other impacts, but we see there's good potential for cell-based meat to outperform animal meats across the board. Again, because you don't have manure coming straight untreated out of a cell-based meat facility unless you're doing things really, really well. So that's one of the biggest victories of this sort of technology innovation. So with that, obviously there's a lot more information here that we can talk about. I'm going to open that to questions, and you can ask about anything that I haven't covered to your satisfaction. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that fascinating breakdown of the life cycle assessment, Isaac, of cell-based meat in the future. It's such an important topic when we look at how this field will look like, because one of the main arguments is the environmental benefits of the field. So it's a really important breakdown. So thank you for that. We have some really exciting questions from the audience. And even though the networking time has started, please stay here if you want to hear the answers to these interesting questions. So one of the first questions we got, Isaac, is considering that starchy vegetables is some of the least demanding foods with large calorie yields per hectare, is it puzzling it has recently been recommended to limit them?
So that's a really good question. And that comes to one of another one of the really key pieces in food and climate. The best diet for climate change is not the healthiest diet. So health and climate change are very different issues. If we only cared about climate change, and we didn't think about the climate impacts of illness and our health system, we would just be drinking sugarcane water and eating like concentrated soybean cake, and that would be it. There'd be no other food. So like, yeah, but that would be very bad for us as a species. That would fail the sustainability test, because we would not be sustaining our health and our well-being and the needs of future generations. So that's the main difference. However, if you want to think about calorie sources for cell-based meat, those cells need to eat something. So if you're thinking about just growing a lot of calories, starchy vegetables, actually potato starch and sugar beets, are a great potential feedstock for the sugars that these cells in these bioreactors need.
Fascinating. Thank you for that answer, Isaac. Our next question focuses on animals in the food. How does food to animals play into the life cycle assessments for food production? Yes, 82% of the global calorie supply may come from plant-based nutrition. However, how much of that goes back to animals? And how does this compare? And also the question asks about the quality of proteins from different sources.
Yeah, I am not a registered dietitian. I am not an expert on protein availability in your diet. But that said, in terms of, let me go up, I think I'm still sharing my graphs, which is fine with me. Big fan of graphs. When we go back to sort of this land use piece here, this is really what we're talking about in terms of the land use for meat, right? So that 77% of land used for animals versus 23% for plants, that includes, so the plant crops we grow to feed to animals are included in that 77% of land for animals. The 23% of land we use to feed ourselves includes just the crops that we actually eat. So I'll just, and there are a lot of, ultra marathoners and professional athletes who eat a vegan diet. So I don't think protein availability is a huge problem for the average me if a linebacker in the Seattle Seahawks or an ultra marathon runner at GFI can live and be vegan.
Absolutely. One of the next questions we have from the audience is there research that has quantified the potential impact of alternative proteins on some of the issues like water scarcity, runoff, for example?
Ooh, water scarcity, yeah. So water scarcity, another really big issue. You may have noticed I didn't talk much about water use in this, and that's because, like the planetary boundary slide showed earlier, overall, around the world, water use isn't a limiting factor in society. However, as someone who's grown up in the arid West of the United States, I'm very familiar with how water use issues can be really, really critical. So it's where you use the water that's a really big deal. And so we have water scarcity footprints to calculate that. We don't have very good data. This chart that I pulled up here shows what data we do have on meat production. So this shows us how many cubic meters of water we need for every kilogram of meat. So for a kilogram of edible meat, we need about, for pork around the world, we need about 50 cubic meters or 50,000 liters of water. But this is not an actual water amount, so this is adjusted for scarcity. So water that's used in places that have plenty of water count for almost nothing, and water that's used in areas that are running out of water count for a lot more than 1 liter. So this is adjusted for that, and you can see that really just depends on where you build your cell-based meat facility and where you get your agricultural inputs, where you get your sugar beets or your sugar cane to feed the cells. But we see the potential here to really reduce those impacts.
Hey, thank you for that, Isaac. And our last question is from Sarah. Great presentation. This is a very complex analysis that should be in the hands of experts around the world. I believe the cost of an LCA can vary with the complexity of the process. Even though, can you comment anything about the price or price ranges of LCA services that we could expect in cell-based meat?
Absolutely. So that's what I do. That's what my company provides. And projects that I've done for companies so far really range from what we call a scoping LCA or a background LCA, just to get an idea of, making some broad assumptions without maybe data from a facility that either you haven't built yet or that you don't have availability, can't share that data yet. What broadly can we say about what goes in, what materials come in, what materials go out, and how that can inform your decision-making process about what materials to use. Something like that could take a couple of weeks and cost anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. A more detailed life cycle assessment that really does go into what processes you use on site, exactly where you source your materials, looking at different scenarios for how you might design the next factory, or different suppliers you might choose, could take a couple of months, and that would run between $15,000 and $25,000 probably at this level. There are more complex LCAs. There are more. There's some certification processes you can go through when you actually have a product with a robust production process. And that would need to be peer reviewed and go through additional steps and certifications. That would cost a bit more than either of those options, but the industry isn't really there yet. So I don't